In a small, quiet town, Police Chief David Richards had built a reputation for being a pillar of integrity. He was the kind of man people trusted, the one who always followed the rules, the one who worked tirelessly to protect the community. His career had spanned decades, and he had earned the respect of both his colleagues and the residents. What no one knew, however, was that Chief Richards harbored a dangerous secret, a secret that, if discovered, would shatter everything he had worked for. For months, Richards had been secretly involved with Jake Harris, a young man with a troubled past. Jake had become known around town for his criminal activities, particularly his drug dealing. He started out small, but over time his operation grew. He moved faster than most, expanding his reach to various parts of the town. Jake had a knack for staying out of the police radar, and his connections ran deep within the underworld. On the surface, he seemed like a typical dealer, but he was far more than that. The affair began when the two crossed paths at a routine drug bust. Richards had been investigating the rise of drug-related crimes in the town, and Jake was one of the prime suspects. But in a twist of fate, their paths crossed under circumstances that neither of them could have foreseen. Richards, tasked with keeping the streets safe, found himself face to face with the very person he had sworn to bring to justice. But instead of arresting him, Richards saw something in Jake that no one else had: vulnerability. Beneath the tough exterior, Richards saw a young man who had been left behind by society, someone who was struggling to survive in a world of chaos. At first, it seemed like a chance encounter, but it quickly became something more. Richards, disillusioned with his life and the system he had long served, found solace in Jake's company. There was a magnetic pull between them, something that neither could resist. Jake, who had been using his position in the drug world to get by, soon realized that Richards was more than just a lawman. He was someone who understood the undercurrents of life. Jake's charisma and street smarts intrigued Richards, while Jake found a strange comfort in the stability and power Richards possessed. Their relationship grew quickly, and soon they were meeting in secret, away from prying eyes. What began as casual conversation soon turned into something deeper. Richards, a man of the law, had crossed lines he never thought he would, drawn into a world that he had spent his career trying to dismantle. The meetings were always in the dead of night, away from the watchful eyes of the town. In dark alleys, empty parking lots, and secluded spots in the woods, Richards and Jake shared more than just a physical connection. They shared a twisted bond, one built on power, secrecy, and mutual need. But this affair was more than just a forbidden relationship. It was a dangerous game. Richards, the one person everyone relied on to keep the town safe, was now entangled with a criminal who could destroy his career with a single word. The stakes were high, and both men knew it. Richards was playing with fire, and as their secret, meetings continued. The risk of being discovered grew with each passing day, yet neither of them seemed willing to stop. The thrill of secrecy, the power of their hidden bond, was too intoxicating to resist. As the weeks went by, the tension mounted. Richards continued his work as the town's police chief by day, pretending to uphold the law, while by night he was involved in a dangerous game of deception and betrayal. Jake, ever the calculating figure, was pulling Richards further into his world, dragging him deeper into the criminal underbelly of the town. But what Richards didn't know was that Jake's world was much more perilous than he could have ever imagined, and the price of their affair would soon come with deadly consequences. As the months passed, the relationship between Police Chief David Richards and Jake Harris grew more complicated and dangerous. What started as a secret affair between a man of the law and a young drug dealer began to evolve into something far more entangled. The deeper Richards got into the relationship, the more he realized just how much of a risk he was taking. He thought he could maintain control, believing that he could compartmentalize his personal life from his professional one, but the lines between the two were starting to blur. Jake had always been careful with his business, running his drug operations with a kind of calculated precision. He had learned to keep a low profile, avoiding detection by both law enforcement and rival dealers. But now, with Richards in his life, the stakes had risen. What was once a covert operation was beginning to unravel as their bond intensified. Richards had begun to cover up for Jake in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. He used his position in the police force to divert investigations, stall raids, and even make sure that Jake's shipments went unnoticed by other officers. What had started as a personal connection was quickly turning into a dangerous alliance. Richards knew that the more he helped Jake, the more deeply he became entangled in a world he had spent his entire career trying to fight against. The weight of the secrecy was beginning to take its toll. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't focus. He was living a double life that he knew could collapse at any moment. And as if that weren't enough, there was another factor that Richards hadn't anticipated: the escalating danger surrounding Jake. Jake's drug operation was growing, and with it came more enemies. Rival dealers, hungry for control of the market, had begun to take notice of Jake's increasing power. Tensions were rising on the streets, and violence was starting to spill over into public view. Richards had managed to keep Jake out of sight of the law so far, but it was becoming clear that he couldn't protect him forever. There were whispers of impending conflict in the drug world, and those whispers had started to reach the police department. Officers were beginning to ask questions, rumors were circulating, and some of Richards's own colleagues began to notice his odd behavior. Jake, sensing the danger, grew increasingly paranoid. His calm exterior began to crack as he started to fear for his life. He knew that rival dealers were closing in, and he also knew that his connection to Richards was becoming a liability. The lawman, who had once been his protector, was now a potential threat. Jake's fear turned into desperation, and his actions grew more unpredictable. He began making rash decisions, taking risks he had previously avoided, and getting involved in situations that put both his and Richards' lives in jeopardy. For Richards, this new level of danger was unsettling. He had never thought of Jake as someone who could get out of control, but now it was becoming clear that the young drug dealer was a loose cannon. Richards had to make a choice: sever ties with Jake and risk everything he had built, or go deeper into the darkness and hope that the danger would somehow pass. Neither option was appealing, but Richards knew he couldn't live this double life forever. The pressure was mounting, and Richards found himself at a crossroads. The consequences of his actions were becoming more immediate and more dangerous. He had started to question his own moral compass. The man who had once been a symbol of law and order was now part of the very system he had sworn to dismantle. And as the web of lies grew tighter around him, Richards realized that escaping this situation would no longer be possible. No matter how much he tried to protect Jake, the consequences of their actions would eventually catch up with them both. What Richards hadn't anticipated was just how quickly the walls would begin to close in. The investigation into the growing drug problem in the town was intensifying, and Detective Amanda Clark was starting to piece together clues that would unravel the dark secrets of the police department. She had been investigating the surge in drug-related activities for months, and the patterns she was seeing pointed toward something much bigger than just a few street-level dealers. As the investigation continued, it became increasingly clear that someone from within the law enforcement was protecting the criminals, someone with enough power to make things disappear. Detective Clark, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for being thorough, had always prided herself on her ability to uncover the truth. She had seen her fair share of corruption, but something about the growing sense of unease in the department felt different this time. There were too many instances where the law seemed to bend or break at the exact moments it shouldn't have. Her suspicions led her to look closer at the town's police chief, David Richards. His behavior had been strange, and there were whispers from other officers about his increasingly erratic decisions. More than that, certain investigations had gone cold under his watch, and there were unexplained lapses in judgment that Clark couldn't ignore. It wasn't long before she discovered that Richards had been involved in more than just managing the police force. Her instincts told her that Richards wasn't just a bystander, he was a key player in something far more dangerous. Clark's investigation into Richards was subtle at first, just gathering information, following leads, and speaking to officers who had worked closely with him. The more she dug, the more she realized that something was seriously off. She uncovered strange patterns in case files that didn't add up. Cases that were mysteriously closed or redirected, often involving individuals linked to Jake Harris, the town's most notorious drug dealer. As Clark's suspicions grew, she started to connect the dots between Richards and Harris. At first, the link wasn't obvious. There was nothing that definitively tied Richards to the drug operation. But as Clark dug deeper, she found that the two men had crossed paths more often than she could have ever imagined. She discovered surveillance footage showing Richards in the vicinity of known drug drops, meeting with figures tied to Harris's operation. What disturbed her the most was the realization that these meetings weren't part of any legitimate investigation. They were secret, private encounters, hidden in the shadows. The deeper Clark got into her investigation, the more she began to understand the extent of the corruption. Richards wasn't just turning a blind eye to Jake Harris's activities. He was actively protecting him. Clark found evidence of Richards using his position to shield Harris from law enforcement, giving him insider information on raids and even delaying actions against the drug network. This wasn't just misconduct. It was conspiracy. Richards was involved in a dangerous partnership with one of the most wanted criminals in the town. But even with all the evidence Clark was collecting, she still needed a smoking gun. A piece of irrefutable evidence that would expose Richards for what he truly was. As the investigation progressed, the pressure on Clark grew. She knew she was on the verge of something big, but the risk of exposing the chief was enormous. Richards was a powerful figure in the town, and going after him meant putting her career and even her life on the line. There were moments when Clark considered stepping back, questioning whether it was worth the danger. But her determination to uncover the truth kept her going. She couldn't let the people she swore to protect be caught in the crossfire of a corrupt system. Clark's breakthrough came when she received an anonymous tip, an envelope containing a series of photos. The images depicted Richards and Harris meeting in a remote location, sharing a briefcase filled with money and drugs. The photos were enough to confirm her worst fears. Richards was not only protecting Harris, he was involved in the drug trade, profiting from it. But there was still one piece missing: the motive. Why would a respected police chief like Richards risk everything for a young drug dealer? Clark knew that the answers lay within the relationship between Richards and Harris, but getting them would require confronting the man at the very top of the department. She had everything she needed to bring him down, but it was clear that this was just the beginning. The deeper she went into this investigation, the more she realized how dangerous the situation had become, not just for her, but for everyone involved. Richard's grip on the town was tightening, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The situation took a sudden and terrifying turn when Jake Harris's lifeless body was found in an alley on the outskirts of town, a gruesome scene that no one could have predicted. The discovery shocked the entire community, sending ripples of fear through the underworld and law enforcement alike. For Detective Amanda Clark, it confirmed her darkest suspicions. The affair between Chief Richards and Jake had gone horribly wrong, and the consequences were now deadly. At first, the police assumed it was a rival dealer seeking retribution. The area was known for drug-related violence, and it seemed plausible that Jake had crossed the wrong person. But for Clark, the timing was too perfect, and the circumstances too suspicious. She knew this wasn't just a random act of violence in the drug trade. Jake's death felt too orchestrated, too controlled. As she examined the crime scene and pieced together the evidence, the theory that Richards had played a role in Jake's death became harder to ignore. Jake, desperate and paranoid in the final weeks of his life, had begun making threats. He had grown increasingly unstable, fearing for his safety as rival dealers closed in. But there was something else, a hint of betrayal in his behavior. He had known too much, and his fear had turned into a dangerous obsession. He knew that. Richards had been protecting him, covering up his dealings, but Jake had also become a liability. Richards, the man who had once kept him safe, was now the one person who could bring his empire crashing down. If Jake were to talk, everything would be exposed. Richards's affair, his corruption, his involvement in the drug network. Richards knew that he couldn't afford to let Jake continue to live with that knowledge. The breaking point came when Jake made a reckless move, threatening to expose everything. In a panic, Richards made the fateful decision to silence him. It wasn't an easy choice, but in his mind, it was the only way to protect himself. As much as Richards had become entangled in the drug world, he never imagined that things would go this far. He had been living in a state of constant fear, managing the delicate balance between his duty as a police chief and his secret involvement with Jake. But Jake's instability and his threat of exposure had pushed Richards to a breaking point. The Cardi murder was planned with chilling precision. Richards used his position to make sure the police department was distracted that night. He knew that the usual patrols would be diverted, and with a few quiet words, he made sure no one would be around when Jake met his end. The confrontation was brutal. Jake had been cornered by the people who had once been his allies, the ones who would do anything to protect their secrets. He had tried to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The people who killed him showed no mercy, and Richards, knowing what was about to happen, had stood by and watched. He had made the call that sealed Jake's fate. For Detective Clark, everything began to fall into place. She had long suspected that Richards was involved, but the cold reality of his betrayal hit her like a ton of bricks. The man who was supposed to protect the town was responsible for the murder of a young man who had once trusted him. She now understood that Jake's death wasn't just about a drug deal gone wrong. It was the tragic result of a relationship that had spiraled out of control, of a man who had lost himself in the pursuit of power and pleasure. Clark knew that bringing Richards down was the only way to stop the cycle of corruption and violence, but it wasn't going to be easy. Richards was still the police chief, and his influence over the department was immense. He had covered his tracks well, leaving behind just enough evidence to make Clark's case, but not enough to directly tie him to the murder. As the investigation grew more intense, the walls around Richards began to close in. Every move he made, every step he took, was being watched by Clark and her team. They were closing in on him, but Richards wasn't going down without a fight. The town was on the brink of discovering the truth, and everything that Richards had worked so hard to keep hidden was about to come to light. The clock was ticking, and the only question left was whether Detective Clark would be able to expose him before the chief's grip on the town tightened even further. But with every passing hour, the danger grew. Richards knew that the walls were closing in on him, and he was willing to do whatever it took to protect himself, even if it meant taking out anyone who stood in his way. The final confrontation came, faster than anyone had anticipated, and it was far more violent than Detective Amanda Clark had ever imagined. Richards, cornered and desperate, knew that the walls were closing in. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the town was beginning to turn against him. But David Richards, the once respected police chief, had one last card to play. He wasn't about to go down quietly. Clark and her team had spent the past few weeks gathering the last pieces of the puzzle. They had been meticulous, tracking down witnesses, piecing together surveillance footage, and uncovering Richards' extensive cover-up efforts. It was clear to everyone that Richards had orchestrated Jake Harris's murder, but what still remained was how far Richards would go to protect himself. The clock was ticking, and Clark knew that once Richards realized that the investigation was no longer something he could control, he would make a move. Richards had started to unravel. His calm exterior, the one that had earned him the title of respected lawman, had given way to paranoia and erratic behavior. Clark had heard rumors from fellow officers that Richards was making frantic calls, trying to shore up his remaining allies in the department. It was only a matter of time before he tried to eliminate anyone who might know too much. As the tension rose, Clark feared that Richards might resort to even more drastic measures to silence anyone who stood in his way. It wasn't long before Richards's worst fears came true. One evening, just as the investigation was gaining momentum, a team of armed men stormed Clark's office. They had been sent to eliminate her and shut down the investigation once and for all. But what Richards hadn't counted on was Clark's readiness. She had anticipated that he might make a move, and with the help of her colleagues, they were prepared. The shootout that followed was chaotic. Gunfire rang out in the darkened streets, and Clark's team fought back with everything they had. It was a battle that neither side was prepared for, but it was clear that Richards' influence in the department had given him a dangerous edge. In the middle of the chaos, Clark managed to make her way to a secure room, where she quickly called for backup. She had no intention of letting Richards escape this time. It wasn't just her career on the line now. It was her life, and the lives of everyone who had trusted her. Her team held their ground, using their tactical training to stop Richards's men from advancing further. But as they engaged in the fight, Clark couldn't help but think of how far Richards had fallen. This was a man who had once stood for justice, now reduced to a desperate fugitive, willing to sacrifice anyone to protect his crumbling empire. Richards, meanwhile, was frantically trying to erase any trace of his involvement. He had ordered his men to wipe out key evidence, but it was too late. Clark's team had already secured crucial documents and recordings, enough to bring him down. When backup finally arrived, it was a race to apprehend the chief before he could escape into the night. Richards, realizing the game was up, made a last-ditch effort to flee, but the police were already closing in on his location. It was a tense standoff in the woods, where Richards had retreated to, thinking he could disappear in the shadows. He had one last weapon, a gun he had taken from the police armory, and he was prepared to use it. But before he could make a move, Clark and her team had surrounded him. The once powerful chief was now a man on the run, his life in ruins. As the officers closed in, Richards's face twisted in defeat, realizing that he had lost everything. The secret affair, the web of lies, and the murder he had thought would secure his position had instead led him to the end of the line. The arrest was swift, and Richards was taken into custody, his fate sealed. The town, once trusting and quiet, now faced the fallout of his betrayal. The truth came out, and the people who had once relied on him to protect them were left to pick up the pieces of their broken community. The scandal rocked the town to its core, and the justice system worked tirelessly to ensure that Richards would face the consequences of his actions. As for Jake Harris, his death was no longer a cold case. It was the key that had unraveled the entire operation. The investigation continued, bringing down several other members of the drug network. But for Detective Clark, the true victory was in exposing the corrupt man who had used his position of power to deceive, control, and ultimately kill to protect his secrets. The case was closed, but for those who had been caught in its web, the scars would remain forever. The town had been changed, its innocence lost, but justice had finally prevailed.